So today I've got some editing to do. Yesterday I was recording the beginning of The Scrooge of Bitcoin, which is a new project that I'm working on for an author through ACX, which is audible.com, basically Amazon's audiobook creation exchange, where authors and narrators / audiobook producers can come together and work on new, generally private projects that will be shared on Audible and iTunes. So, as you can see, yesterday's recording that I made was done in a program called Audacity, which is a free software used for recording audio and editing audio. And it is very effective, I must say, from my experience. So I have played around with various other pieces of software, but I've found that Audacity, the free piece of software that I've used ever since some of my very earliest little test recordings. So my complete audiobook of The Hobbit that I've talked about a lot in the past, that was all recorded on an old mobile phone, incredibly basic. And a couple of other little early samples were also just done on the voice recorder app on that phone. But quite quickly, when I started thinking about these things just a little bit more seriously, I discovered Audacity. And so when I first played around with The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, back in 2017, or was it even the end of 2016? Gosh, time really flies. That was all done on Audacity, and I've been using it ever since. So like I said, I have played around with some paid software, various different things, but I always just end up coming back to Audacity. I feel very comfortable using it. It largely does everything I need it to do for the sort of content that I generally make. And then when I'm moving on to the video creation rather than the audio editing, I have a number of different pieces of software that I use. But for the audio recording and the audio editing, Audacity is my boy. So here you can see the audio waveforms for the recording that I made yesterday that you can see on that first behind the scenes recording an audiobook for Audible video. And if you press this little fit project to width button here, you can see the entire approximately 30 minutes recording. You can see at the bottom there, 31 minutes, 26 seconds. And I'm ready to go to work. I can see that everything recorded according to plan, basically. I know that this little bit here will be my little closing statement that I made, just that little brief reflection that I made on my thoughts on how the recording had gone. The waveform isn't as broad, it's not as tall as the rest, which is basically telling me that it's a little bit quieter. So I know that that will have been my softer spoken conclusion at the end there. And these little spaces at the start are reflective of the little pauses that I made in the beginning there when first settling in to the reading. So let's take a little listen. Okay. And I'm just going to switch my headphones over here. So that's me getting settled. And I know, so my mission today is to basically create a first finished, and it's only going to be a first draft, but basically a finished first 15 minutes of this audiobook. So this is a novella. It's basically a short story. It will probably be about 2 hours of finished recording. But today, with that 30 minutes that I recorded, I should be able to use that to create the first 15 minutes, which is basically the first deadline that a narrator needs to make if they're creating an audiobook through ACX for Audible. So that's the mission. It doesn't need to be perfect by any means. It is basically a first draft. But I want to make things as close to the finished product as I can get at this stage, really, without spending an awful lot of time on this, because then I will share that with the author, and they get basically a finished 15 minutes that they can then provide feedback on. They can listen through, see how you're approaching things, and you've got something to work together on there. We can discuss various things and how we're going to go forward. Do they like how I've approached the beginning here? And of course, we've already had discussion before this process started, and shared a few thoughts and feelings back and forth, and I got stuck in, as you heard yesterday. So one thing I know straight off the bat is that I can just delete any unnecessary spaces, like recording that just literally reflects me setting up, or talking to the camera or anything like that. So this bit here straight away I can just get rid of. That was me saying okay and setting up for the recording. But let's listen on a little bit. So, this is my first test recording of the Scrooge of Bitcoin. So I will leave the title in here, and I will just delete the opening. By Paul W. Samuelson. And I'll leave this in as well as an example of just roughly how I will introduce the audiobook. But this I can remove. Commissioned, and here will just be like little bumps and things. Breathing, not required at all. So grab all that and delete. And then if you've watched that video from yesterday, you'll hear that I had a few attempts at this opening. So as I said in the video description, I'd already read through about half of the manuscripts 2 or 3 times, and the opening like 5-6 pages or so that I knew I was going to tackle yesterday, I read that through a couple more times. But in the beginning, I'm just reading it through in my head, and then sometimes I'll just read it softly spoken to myself, just getting myself accustomed, really, and just getting a little bit of a feeling of like, okay, how am I going to approach this? What sort of style am I going to use for this particular book? Trying to basically find the author's voice, which all helps to basically bring the words to life in the style that you sort of feel works best. So it's going to just be my interpretation, and then I can present that to the author and say, hey, what do you think? Do you want something that's a little bit more upbeat, or a little bit calmer, and doesn't feel too forced, a little bit more relaxed, or do you want something that's quite intentionally being a little bit kind of comedic or ironic? I mean, this is a satire at the end of the day, so so the author here is to some extent using Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol as a sort of basis for this work, which is a satire of banking and Bitcoin's place within the banking world and how it's influenced various things and various people. So certainly pro Bitcoin, and apparently there's quite a Bitcoin community out there, and quite a lot of works that sort of take place in this Bitcoin universe, which I found quite interesting. I had no idea. So let's just listen to these first two versions here, and I can already remember which bits I'm going to use and which bits I'm not going to use, but just for fun, let me play this through to you. Mammy Simon hated Bitcoin. There was no doubt about it. And by the way, one thing that I will always try to remove are these sorts of unnecessary mouth sounds. I'm really not a fan of them. And generally, I try to remove quite a lot of breathing sounds as well. I personally find it quite distracting from the text and quite unnecessary. And as I've become a more experienced narrator and audiobook producer over these last 2 or 3 years, I've noticed that my control of my breathing has much improved. So I do actually manage my breathing better, basically. So the microphone will pick up far less breathing sounds and often even mouth sounds than when I first started narrating. So it's not as much as an issue as it used to be. But, and here, this little click here, not a nice sound, that would be removed anyway, because it's not even a part of the narration itself. You can see it's separated, so that would have all just got taken out anyway. But if I come across these little clicks and wet sounds and pops and things like that that are actually within a sentence or right before a sentence begins or just as the sentence finishes, I will generally edit those out. Likewise with unnecessary breathing sounds, I'll either edit them out or at least soften them. And I can show you a couple of ways that I do that. The only exception to that little rule that I've found is if it in some ways actually adds something to the audiobook or a particular character. So if you've been listening to my Dracula audiobook that I've been producing, Dracula so far for me has been completely unique because it's the first epistolary type of book that I've ever narrated. So the entire book is actually presented by Bram Stoker in a form of letters, journal entries, and phonograph recordings. Therefore, there is no narrator's voice. There is no narrator, which is very strange, and I've found that far, far more difficult than I realized. I was really taken off guard when I first started recording Dracula about this time last year. So the book opens with Jonathan Harker's journal, and the entire chapter is first person Jonathan Harker describing his journey through Europe on his way to Transylvania. So the entire first chapter, therefore, needs to be in character voice. Of course, you could just read that completely neutrally, just in your own voice, and so therefore he is sort of the narrator. But then you will find that we move on, and there is a Mina Harker's journal. There are various other characters suddenly coming into it with their own letters, diary entries, and the rest of it. You've got Dr. Seward's diary. There are segments from Arthur Holmwood and Quincy Morris and Lucy Westenra, and then Dr. Van Helsing, and so on and so on and so on. And therefore they all need their own voice, or at least some form of character, some difference in tone, maybe accent, pitch, speed, emphasis, intonation, etc., 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 to differentiate them for the listener, to keep things interesting, to make things more immersive. So I was aware with Dracula, in my opinion, not to over-exaggerate those features. I didn't want it to become a pantomime, or equally just be too sort of almost it can get a little bit comedic, almost too light-hearted if you have a lot of very exaggerated character voices, in my opinion. At the end of the day, there is only one narrator, myself in this instance, if we're talking about Dracula, and the listener is generally going to be aware of that. You can hear it, however good a voice actor I think you are, and they know it. They're tuning in to Stephen Garnett's production of Dracula. So if you're really exaggerating each character, I think that can become a little bit distracting. And I've been particularly aware of that with more serious novels, and also when approaching female characters, which is particularly difficult, especially when you've got quite a deep voice. You know, like it's a bit of a complex subject, I suppose, but that is one of the reasons why I don't have too broad a range of female character voices. Like I have a couple of sort of go-tos, and then I just sort of settle into 2 or 3 of these sorts of voices, and I just try and adjust them with the sort of personality that I feel coming across from the writing of that particular character. So I could go into more detail about how I approached Mina Harker and Lucy Westenra, and how I tried to differentiate those 2 characters, for example, but it feels like quite a big tangent there. So, but Dracula in its style was and is very challenging, with there being no narrator's voice. But here, and with most books, particularly modern books, you have a set narrator's voice. And for me, I want that to be very clear. I want to breathe life into the words. I try and help to set the mood and feeling. I try and sort of reflect the author's voice, if that makes sense, as much as I can without really over exaggerating things. And that really depends on the book and what I feel from the book. So if it's a dark gothic horror, the voice is going to be different, of course, than if I'm reading Harry Potter or the Chronicles of Narnia. And likewise, reading Pride and Prejudice versus Alice in Wonderland. So even if books are from a similar time period, there could be a very different style, perhaps a different audience, and therefore my narrator's voice will sort of change accordingly as well. So those breathing sounds and mouth sounds, I still often do either remove or reduce those when producing a work like Dracula, but as the entire book is actually from the perspective of the characters, and the characters themselves are doing the narrating, they are speaking, then I really don't mind. And sometimes I even actively encourage little bits of mouth sound, heavier breathing, and things like that, because it helps to really highlight the character and the emotion and the realism of that particular scene. So yeah, generally remove and soften those things, but when it's a character speaking, I will review that much more carefully, more specifically, and in terms of something like Dracula, I might almost leave it quite raw and quite natural, as if those characters are really just sat there, maybe reading into a phonograph, and you're there listening back, perhaps to this genuine raw recording that you've dug out of the archives somewhere, you know. So here, this was basically version 1 of the Mammy Simon introduction. And here, you can often tell that this will be the exact same recording as here, just looking at the similarities of the waveforms. So this looks extremely similar to this, and also this looks very similar to these two. So this will undoubtedly be my third attempt. So let's listen to attempt 2. Mammy Simon hated Bitcoin. There was no doubt about it. Day after day, the rich and wicked old woman sat on a large throne at the top of her Gotham City tower, surrounded by her precious gold sacks and dozens of money-grubbing minions huddled at her feet. This, I thought, was okay. But I just had a little pause. I was reading a little bit on the PDF in front of me, and I thought, okay, I'll just have one more read through here. And this is, like I said, a first draft stage. So at this point, I want to get through as much of the story as I can, and then I know that I can always review when editing, when listening back, and I can mark things for re-recording. So if I don't nail every single line, every single paragraph, every single character voice or piece of dialogue in this first recording, it really doesn't matter. This is just for me to get a feel of it. I've got something to listen back to. I've got something to edit. In this case, when I'm actually producing something for somebody else, not just for myself to then be shared on YouTube and whatnot, I've got something to present to the author in this example, and I can use that for feedback and further experimentation. But here I had a third attempt. With it being the first line, I just wanted to get one that I was, happy enough with, that I felt like, yeah, okay, I can use something here. Mammy Simon hated Bitcoin. So there was no doubt about it the most. And you've got to remember that this is going to be edited. So when I'm recording it, I don't mind if I read just a little bit too slowly, if I have a pause that's a couple of seconds too long. I know that I can speed things up, cut things out, tighten things. So the feeling, the enunciation, the clarity of the words, the tone, perhaps, they're the most important thing. The pause, the breath intake, certain things that would really matter if you were reading live, for instance, they don't really matter here. So this one, I felt the emphasis was was just closer to how I had envisaged in my mind when first reading this. So it was clear, good feeling, and I felt, yeah, that's good enough. I knew that the actual timing wasn't quite as good. It was a little bit too spaced out. As you can see, there's a broader gap here than here, and especially here when I was first practicing things. But I just felt that the actual delivery of the line was pretty good. So then I continued. Day after day, the rich and wicked old woman sat on a large throne at the top of her Gotham City tower, surrounded by her precious gold sacks and dozens of money-grubbing minions. But this huddled I actually felt was probably like a little bit weaker than this first attempt here. So let's just listen back to that again. Day after day, the rich and wicked old woman sat on a large throne at the top of her Gotham City tower. Day after day, the rich and wicked old woman sat on a large throne at the top of her Gotham City tower. To be fair. Day after day, the rich and wicked old woman sat on a large throne at the top of her Gotham City tower, surrounded by her precious gold sacks and dozens of money-grubbing minions huddled at her feet. Let's just listen to this. Surrounded by her precious gold sacks and dozens of money-grubbing minions. So they're pretty similar. Huddled at her feet. If I just put my other headphone on, I think I can hear this a little clearer. Little bit more clearly. Sorry to play this through once more, but these are the things you've got to do when you're producing an audiobook. Sometimes you listen to the same thing, maybe 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 times. It really depends on what sort of standards you're looking for, or what sort of presentation you're looking for, as to how meticulous you're going to get with certain things. But I'll just play these through again for myself here. Day after day, the rich and wicked old woman sat on a large throne at the top of her Gotham City tower, surrounded by her precious gold sacks and dozens of money-grubbing minions huddled at her feet. Day after day, the rich and wicked old woman sat on a large throne at the top of her Gotham City tower, surrounded by her precious gold sacks and dozens of money-grubbing minions huddled at her feet. Yeah, they were closer than I remembered them. Now I'm going to have to listen to this and this again to just see which of these two. Maybe I'd misremembered this slightly. 1 second. Mammy Simon hated Bitcoin. Mammy Simon hated Bitcoin. There was no doubt about it. There was no doubt about it. Day after day, the rich and wicked old woman sat on a... Day after day, the rich and wicked old woman sat on a large throne I remembered top. About it's the emphasis of the wicked old woman. Day after day, the rich and wicked old woman sat on a large throne. Day after day, the rich and wicked old woman sat on a large throne. Extremely similar. Just checking I did not mess something up there. Let me redo. Okay, then for the time being, I will take this second version. They were closer than I remembered them. But that's absolutely fine. Moving on. From her high and powerful seat in the chamber, she plotted sinister acts against Bitcoin, constantly brooding over it, then yelling in wild fits of derangement. Bitcoin is a fraud, a Ponzi, a long-dead experiment. Indeed, Bitcoin presented a most troubling problem for her and her large investment bank. She was often seen wringing her thin, bony hands in anguish because of the digital currency. Its design and popularity threatened her elitist power and old money ways, as it promised great hope to the world for freedom. So this I all thought was pretty decent. This was my first real attempt at Mammy Simon's voice, and I quite liked it. Those of you that have heard me read Roald Dahl's The Witches live a couple of months ago will be able to tell that there are some similarities here. And as you read on, or as you continue to listen, you will see that the Mammy Simon character is extremely exaggerated in her description and everything. And the author does a pretty good job of describing her voice as well as her appearance as well. So that's what led me to go for this very over-exaggerated and like screeching, high-pitched voice. So for someone out there that's watching this video for maybe like some sort of ideas about how to approach narrating an audiobook for themselves, don't take this that I just randomly pulled that voice out of thin air. This came from reading the text a few times, and then using my past experience to sort of think, okay, I don't want her to sound exactly like the Grand High Witch from The Witches. That character, at the end of the day, has some sort of foreign accent. Perhaps there's some German in there, perhaps even some further southeastern European accent. It's hard to exactly say, but there was an influence that I could use, a connection that I could make, and therefore I sort of based this initial attempt of the Mammy Simon voice on my reading of The Grand High Witch from The Witches. And I think it works. So far, I'm thinking it's working pretty well. But one thing that you can see is that there are these large spaces in between certain sections, and this is not gonna work. It's not gonna sound nice to just have a random 2.5 second space here and a random 2.5 second space here, and you can see there's a very lengthy space here, 6.5 seconds. And that's where a lot of the work goes in with audio editing. And this is where a lot of the creativity is as well. You might not really think that there's really much in that. It's like, okay, there's a long space, just make the space shorter. But how short all these little spaces are, so it's not just these big obvious ones like this, but it can be smaller little gaps, which are all over the place in between every sentence generally, or sometimes even within a sentence. Getting the timing of that empty space right is very difficult and takes a lot of practice. And that generally, I find, dictates the pace of the reading and the pace of the chapter and the delivery of the book more, or at least equally, to the actual reading of the lines, the actual narration itself. So it can help to make something feel a little bit too hurried, or equally that there is just too much of a pause, and you can sort of be like hanging, waiting for the next line to come. You lose the momentum or the tension. But equally in a different scene, those pauses, these deliberate pauses, they can really help to add tension as well. So there's definitely a parallel with that as to how an author would use short, sharp sentences, for example, and what punctuation they use, even how they space things on the page, all can affect how the story is presented, what sort of atmosphere you're creating, what sort of mood you're creating, and how the reader in that case will actually digest the words that you're putting down. But when I'm editing, these days I'm pretty methodical. So normally, I've sort of settled into my own little production style sort of thing. So generally, I listen through to the entire recording that I've made, and I just focus on getting the actual lines of dialogue and narration that I want to keep. And I don't worry too much about residual noise, background noise that the microphone has picked up. I don't focus too much on the breathing and the mouth sounds. And I don't focus too much on the, let's call it, the pacing. So the actual timing of when each next line comes in. I mainly just focus on, say there are 3 different versions of a particular sentence, which of those 3 am I going to keep? And you can often pick and choose extremely precisely, especially when you become more adept at editing. So you don't necessarily say there are 3 versions of this sentence here. You don't necessarily need to choose version 1, version 2, version 3. You see there's a natural break here, and that break could have come at different times within that sentence, depending where emphasis was placed. So that could be a conscious choice, or where a breath came naturally, or how you controlled the breath within that sentence is going to produce a different break, and therefore can sort of change the flow of a sentence. But you see that there's a natural break here. If you have 3 different versions and they all had a break here, but there was something different about the rest of the sentence, you could technically take the first bit from version 1 and the second bit from version 2 and this third little bit here from version 3 if you wanted. And I do that sometimes. So if I just feel that there was something I particularly liked about one version, but the second version, it wasn't quite as good here, but I actually really nailed it with the final aspect of that sentence, I will cut those 2 together. Sometimes it's not going to work. Sometimes you'll be able to tell it just feels a little bit disjointed. Sometimes it can work extremely well. And then if you zoom in further, literally using the program, but also just mentally, you can break down. So this is the first section that I just talked about with the sort of natural break here, which will be breathing, inhalation. You can break this down into further chunks. And like I said, as you become more precise with editing, you can really clip out and clip in certain sections just within even quite a tightly read section as this. So sometimes I might have just had like a nasty little mouth click or just a tiny mispronunciation or something, but I felt the rest of the sentence was, or the rest of the, it could be an entire paragraph, I just thought was fantastic, and I don't want to have to re-record the whole thing. Sometimes you just really feel like you nailed it in that first natural delivery, and you get conscious that re-recording it might just lose something of that natural feeling that you had the first time around. So what you can do is you probably will need to re-record the sentence, but you can just cut out maybe one syllable from 10 words, and like a like a surgeon on the operating theatre sort of thing, you can just cut out that one little bad bit and sew in that that clean pronunciation or whatever, and play it back, and it will sound as seamless as if it was recorded just like that in the first instance. But that really does take some practice. You can have nasty discrepancies if you don't get it just right. It can sound very obvious if something's perhaps just too loud or too soft, or the recording environment was a little bit different, or if you just don't cut it in the right place, you might get a sort of doubling or a tripling, like a b sound rather than just a b. There can be sort of other like little distortions and nasty bits of audio, like residual audio left over if you don't get those cuts just right. So sometimes I find it almost impossible, and I'm just better off re-recording it and just using another version. But other times it works really, really, really well, and you can't even tell that you've made those adjustments at all. So for now, I would leave all these spaces, like I said, and I would just keep on moving through until I got to the end of this 30-minute recording. And then I would go back to the start, and then you're going in with a finer ear, basically, and you're refining everything. You're going to be listening very carefully, removing background sound, removing those unnecessary breathing sounds or reducing them. And there's different ways you can do that. And then really tightening up the spacing and listening back through it maybe several times, and really, sometimes I just close my eyes, listen through to 2 or 3 minutes of audio, maybe go back through, listen to the same piece again, and try and basically picture myself as the listener listening to this for the first time. And I'm sort of aware of like what I can imagine. Basically, really, really trying to listen in carefully to the delivery of everything, the pacing of everything. Do you have time to really consume what is going into your ears, or are things too rapid or too slow? It's it probably sounds like almost unnecessary, like this level of detail, but it really, really, really does make a huge difference. But in this case, although I would skip this just for the moment, just to show you like a very basic example, I will see how I can reduce this 6.5 second gap to something that fits more naturally with the flow of this paragraph. So I'll just listen through to this little section here. Its design and popularity threatened her elitist power and old money ways, as it promised great hope to the world for freedom and prosperity. So we're switching from narrator back to Mammy Simon here. So a little bit of a gap, I think, feels quite natural. I'd normally go for sort of like 1 second, 1.5 seconds in this sort of instance. So you can see if I highlight the white space here and press play, sometimes you will find that although it looks empty, there may still actually be a little bit of sound just trailing off from the end of that sentence. And you need to be careful not to just cut willy-nilly, because sometimes you might cut off the last syllable. Sometimes I remember when I was first editing, I sometimes didn't realize I cut off maybe a T. So if it said succinct, and it will look like, you're just trying to work through at a sort of reasonable pace, you're getting more accustomed to editing and everything. And it looks like succinct is all this little section here, and I'm like, okay, grab that section, delete that, and then you notice that it'll say succinct, and the little end of the T has just disappeared. So you need to be careful there. And sometimes if you remove too much of maybe the breathing sounds, just by simply cutting it out, you can hear that there will be sort of broken bits of breath. So you need to be sort of precise. Like, you don't want it to sound like so this bit here, and prosperity, and then minions, and there will be a breath taken there, probably in many cases, and you can just basically mute that breath. But say you're wanting to have a natural breath between those two, but you don't want it to be a 6-second gap, you can't just cut any random piece of that 6 seconds out to make it 1.5 seconds. You need to actually listen to where that breath was taken, of course, but you can't see the breath in the waveform because it's too quiet. So you need to listen through to that again, basically. Make sure that you keep the breath, but then cut the rest. Otherwise, it will say "and prosperity," and instead of "and prosperity minions," you'll have it sounding like "and prosperity minions," and there will be like this sort of cut where the breath just stops halfway through. It just doesn't sound natural, and that can cause other issues in other circumstances as well. So here we want to reduce it to approximately, let's say, 2 seconds just to test. So if I play here, it is basically deathly silent all the way through, pretty much. So there might be some sound in the middle there, but in the middle I'm not really too concerned. So the length of selection is 6.397. So if I reduce that to 4.4, it will leave 2 seconds left. Okay, and then we can listen to that back now. And I can see that this gap here is probably too long between Mammy Simon screeching minions, and I think this is the narrator coming back in here. So I almost know that I can probably just half that, listen to it, see how it sounds, but I'll leave it for now. As it promised great hope to the world for freedom and prosperity. Yeah, so that is still too
minions.
So that estimate of more like 1.5 seconds that I said in the first place was probably more accurate. So I'll take another 0.8 of a second out, and I will just reduce this a little bit because I know that I will want that to be a little bit tighter. That just comes from practice. So if I listen to this through now, we should be getting closer to how I would want it to sound. Its design and popularity threatened her elitist power and old money ways, as it promised great hope to the world for freedom and prosperity.
Minions!
Mammy Simon declared early on the day before Christmas. So at this stage, I don't mind a little bit of a dramatic pause, because it just sort of suits the mood of this sort of exposition here in the opening. But you could remove just a little bit more between minions and the narrator. And this is a very personal preference, how close you want the narrator's voice to come back after a character voice. Sometimes it sounds great to have the narrator come right behind it, especially in action sequences, I've noticed. So if it was Aragorn in The Lord of the Rings, like saying, Elendil, I would normally want the narrator to be right behind that to keep the emphasis, and, you get this semblance of him charging down the hill towards the danger or whatever. So if you sort of have it, Elendil, Aragorn called, you're just sort of like, why have you left me hanging there? As if you have Elendil, Aragorn called. It's just all in one motion. You're not even really aware of what's character, what's narrator, but you're just there. You're on the hill, you're charging down. Where are the orcs? How's Boromir doing? And you're in the action. But sometimes a little longer pause can better suit the particular mood and moment of the piece. So in this instance, let's just cut it like this and see how it sounds. Minions! Mammy Simon declared early on the day before Christmas. It's absolutely fine. You could go a little bit tighter, but I quite like it because it's this is one of the first times this character's spoken. We don't really know anything about Mammy Simon at this point, and it just gives the listener sort of time to reflect, really. So, like, what is going on? Who is this woman? Why is she screaming minions at someone or something? Like, so it just allows that little bit more thought and imagination to go in. You don't need to be charging down a hill at this point or feeling like you're just running into the next sentence. Like, I don't feel like the author is trying to create a sense of urgency here. It's more curious and quirky, humorous a little, and he's also wanting to sort of develop his world. So you want a little bit of time to reflect. Don't know why there's such a big space here. Let's see what was going on. I'm just skipping ahead. Our story begins. Yeah, so this will have been me at that moment, just skimming ahead, gathering myself a little bit, and just making sure that I delivered this next bit accurately. But we don't need a 2.5 second gap here. So I will cut that down by half. And like I said, you do need to, like, potentially, often you do need to be careful when cutting these spaces. But I know just from experience, and, you know, I'm working with my own audio here, not someone else's. I sort of trust how this is recorded. I know how I go about recording things now. So, you know, I've obviously recorded hundreds and hundreds of files like this now, so I am experienced. So I know that if I've interrupted a breath here or something just sounds a little bit odd, I know that I can clean that up, no problemo. And also, this isn't Dracula. This is a narrator's voice, not a character voice. So I know as well that I probably just want complete silence here anyway. So if there's a little mouth sound or there's a breath that doesn't just sound quite right or something here in this space, I'm just going to mute that anyway. So it really doesn't matter. So I can be quite savage with the editing, really. As when editing Dracula, I do need to be more precise with certain things. But like I said, technically less precise than I would be with Lord of the Rings, for example. With other things, it depends on the presentation and the style of what you're producing as to what you really want to focus on. So with Dracula, like with The Secret Garden, I'm going for this sort of raw reading style. You've got genuine page turning. I'm actually reading from the book. And there are characters leaving diaries and phonograph entries. So I want this to feel authentic in a different way to Lord of the Rings, for example, where I really wanted it to feel... I used to use the word professional, but they're just different. I've noticed that, especially over time, they're different types of professional presentation. But basically, for it to be more polished, cleaner in a sense, and therefore the editing is sharper and more thorough. But there's still, as you can sort of get the idea here, like there's a lot of method to producing this more sort of raw reading style as well. Like when I first started The Secret Garden, it was genuinely like 99% or 95% raw reading. I really was clicking record, opening the book, and just reading as it came. And if there were glaring mistakes and things like that, I would remove those, and I would be narrating a second version, and I would just clip out the mistakes. Excuse me. But by and by, it really was raw. It was just a sort of candid, sort of bedside reading or fireside reading, as Dracula, it's a bit of a mix between that sort of Lord of the Rings style and the Secret Garden style. So it's got the presentation closer to the Secret Garden, but there is still much more editing going on than particularly in those opening chapters of the Secret Garden. So I'm gonna leave it here for today. I'm not going to sit and edit through the entire thing for this video, but I hope that this video, my first ever behind the scenes editing video. I have done a little bit of behind the scenes editing live streaming on Twitch a couple of years ago, but this is basically the first regular video that I've made of this type. So I hope it's just been a little bit interesting. I've just offered a little bit of an insight into my process, and whether you're new to me and my channel, or whether you've been following me for 2 or 3 years now, or whatever, I just hope you've found it a little bit interesting, maybe even a little bit useful in one way or another. And if you would like to see more videos like this, I'm going to be continuing with this editing, as I've got a bit of a deadline to meet today. But if you would like to see more videos like this in the future, please do let me know. And likewise with the video that I shared yesterday, where I was, for the first time, basically recording my actual narration process, or basically the first element of narration process. There's always going to be some pre-reading and preparation and thought going into it before I even sit down and press record for the first time. But you saw that first stage of the first element of recording with that video. So if you would like to see things similar to this, and maybe you have other ideas, or the things that you would like to watch and listen to, different types of videos in this sort of behind the scenes genre, or like how-to genre, then please do comment and let me know. I would really appreciate it. And my idea, like I mentioned in the video description of the actual recording video that I shared yesterday, my idea was to make these behind the scenes videos exclusive for my channel members and certain patron reward tiers over on Patreon, as just a little added extra, basically, whilst I go about and make my regular content as usual, and live streams and all the rest of it. So let me know, did you enjoy this? I hope so. Okay, well, thanks for listening, thanks for watching, and you take care, stay foxy, and I'll read to you soon.